At my grandmother's funeral, my aunt leaned over to me and whispered that the house would be listed by the end of the week. She said it with a smile, the kind of smile that people wear when they think they've already won. She didn't look at me when she said it. She was scanning the room, probably calculating square footage in her head, probably already thinking about the realtor she was going to call on Monday morning. I was sitting in the front pew with a program in my hands, and my grandmother's favorite hymn still echoing in my chest, and my aunt was already selling the house where I had spent every single summer of my childhood. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the house already had a new owner. Me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that moment meant everything, you need to understand where I came from. You need to understand my family and the particular way they had of making you feel like you were invisible even when you were standing right in front of them. You need to understand my grandmother, Estelle May Hargrove, who was the only person in my entire life who ever made me feel like I was enough. Let me take you back. I was 7 years old the first time I understood that I was not the favorite, not in the way that children sometimes feel unloved when a sibling gets a bigger piece of cake or a better birthday present. I mean, I understood it in a deep, structural way, the way you understand that a building has been designed with certain rooms and certain people in mind, and you are not one of those people. My mother had 2 daughters. My older sister, Renata, who was 11 and beautiful and loud, and me, Clara, who was 7 and quiet and, apparently, forgettable. We were at my uncle's house for Thanksgiving, the year my grandfather had just passed away, and the whole family was gathered in the way families gather after loss, pressing themselves together like they're afraid of falling apart separately. I remember the smell of the house, turkey and cinnamon and something slightly burnt, and I remember the sound of my cousins running through the hallway upstairs, and I remember sitting at the kids' table alone because Renata had been invited to sit with the adults that year. My mother announced it at dinner. She said Renata was old enough now. She said it like it was a graduation, like something had been earned. Nobody looked at me. Nobody said anything about when I would be old enough. I ate my turkey by myself at a table meant for 6 and listened to the adults laugh at things I didn't understand. My grandmother was the one who found me later. I was sitting outside on the back porch in the cold because I didn't want anyone to see me cry, and she came out with a blanket and 2 cups of hot chocolate, and she sat down next to me without saying anything for a long time. The yard was dark, and the trees had all lost their leaves, and the sky was that particular shade of gray that means winter is serious and here to stay. She said, "You know what the quietest rivers are?" I shook my head. She said, "The deepest ones." I didn't fully understand what she meant then. I was 7, but I held on to it. I held on to it for years, the way you hold on to things when you don't have much else. My mother was not a cruel woman in the way that villains are cruel in movies. She didn't yell. She didn't hit. She was cruel in a much quieter way, the way that's harder to explain to people who haven't experienced it. She was cruel through her attention. She gave Renata all of hers, and she gave me what was left, which was usually not very much. When Renata got a lead in the school play, my mother took 3 days off work to help her rehearse. When I got a solo in the choir concert, my mother said that was nice, honey, and then asked Renata what she wanted for dinner. When Renata won a regional science fair, my mother cried happy tears and put the ribbon on the refrigerator and kept it there for 2 years. When I was accepted into the honors English program in 6th grade, my mother nodded and said she hoped it wouldn't interfere with my chores. My father was more absent than anything else. He worked long hours and came home tired and had very little left for either of his daughters. But what he had he also mostly gave to Renata. I think because she was louder. I think because she demanded things and he found it easier to give them to her than to refuse her. I was too quiet to demand anything. I was too used to disappearing. The one place I never disappeared was my grandmother's house. Grandma Estelle lived 40 minutes outside of town in a white house with green shutters that sat on 2 acres of land, and from the time I was very small she would have me stay with her during the summers. Not Renata. Just me. Renata didn't like the country. She said it was boring. She wanted to be in town with her friends. And my parents allowed this because they always allowed Renata whatever she wanted. But I didn't want to be in town with my friends. I wanted to be at my grandmother's house, where the morning smelled like coffee and biscuits, and the afternoon smelled like the garden, and the evening smelled like whatever she was cooking for supper and whatever candles she had lit in the living room. She taught me things, real things, not school things. She taught me how to can tomatoes and how to patch a hole in fabric and how to read the weather by looking at the sky. She taught me how to balance a checkbook long before any school thought to mention it, and she taught me how to read a contract, sitting at her kitchen table with a magnifying glass and a cup of tea, pointing to clauses and saying, "Always read the fine print, Clara, always. Because the people who don't want you to read it are the ones who put the dangerous things there." She told me about her life. She had grown up with nothing. Her parents had been sharecroppers, and she had picked her first crops at age 6, and she had gone to school in shoes that were 2 sizes too small because they were the only ones her family could afford. She had worked and saved and studied and eventually built a life that was entirely her own, and the house, the white house with the green shutters, was the physical proof of it. She had bought it with her own money. She had painted it herself. She had planted every tree in the yard. She said to me once, "This house knows me, Clara. It knows every story I ever told inside it. When I'm gone, it'll still know them." I was maybe 12 when she said that. I pressed my hand against the wall of the kitchen the way you'd press your hand against a living thing, and I thought I understood what she meant. My grandmother was not close with her children, my mother and my uncle, Ray. She loved them, I think, in the way you love people who disappeared you loved despite everything, but they had disappointed her in various ways over the years, and there was a careful distance between them. My mother thought Grandma Estelle was too blunt. My uncle thought she was too stubborn. They both visited out of obligation, usually on holidays, usually with the specific energy of people who are waiting for something to be over. They had their eyes on the house. I didn't fully understand this until I was about 14. I was at a family gathering, one of the big ones that happened every couple of years when enough people were in the right city at the right time, and I overheard my uncle talking to my father in the kitchen. I was supposed to be in the living room, but I had gone to get a glass of water, and I stopped in the hallway when I heard my name. Or rather, I stopped when I heard what my uncle was saying about the house. And then I realized my name was part of the conversation. My uncle was saying that when Grandma Estelle passed, which he said she would, sooner or later, the house and the land were worth real money. He said the county had been developing in that direction for years. He said there were buyers who would pay very well for 2 acres in that location. He said the thing about Estelle was she had always been soft on Clara. Everyone knew it, and they would need to make sure everything was handled properly before the girl got any ideas. My father said, "What kind of ideas?" My uncle said, "You know what kind." Then they heard me in the hallway and the conversation stopped. I went back to the living room. I sat next to Renata, who was on her phone and didn't look up. I thought about what I had heard for the rest of the night, and I didn't say anything to anyone, because I was 14 and quiet, and I had learned that quiet was safer. But I thought about it. I thought about it for a long time. The following summer, I went to my grandmother's house as usual. I helped her in the garden, and I learned how to properly store seeds for the following year, and I listened to her stories about her parents and her childhood and the early years of her marriage and all the things she had built and the things she had lost. And one afternoon, when we were sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm come in from the west, she looked at me sideways and said, "I need to tell you some things, Clara, grown-up things. Are you ready for grown-up things?" I was 15. I said yes. She told me that she had been thinking about her affairs for some time. She said she was not sick. She wanted me to know that first. She was not dying imminently as far as she knew, but she was 71 years old, and she had watched too many families tear themselves apart over property and money to let that happen to hers. She said she had been working with a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had an office in town, and they had been putting things in order. She said, "I want to leave this house to you." I said, "Grandma." She said, "I know what your uncle has been saying. I know what your mother thinks. I know they believe this house will be sold when I'm gone and divided up between them. But this house is mine, Clara. I bought it. I painted it. I planted those trees. And I will decide who gets it." She reached over and took my hand. Her hands were strong. They had always been strong. She said, "You're the only one who ever loved this house the way it deserves to be loved. You're the only one who ever actually listened when I talked about what it means. You're the only one who understands that a house isn't just walls. It's a life." I was crying. I was 15, and I was sitting on my grandmother's porch listening to rain come down on the garden. And I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was 7 at that Thanksgiving table, except this time it was not from sadness. She handed me a tissue and said, "Don't cry on me. We have more to talk about." There was more to talk about. She explained that Patricia Osei had advised her on the cleanest way to transfer the property. She explained that a deed transfer during her lifetime, properly documented, would mean the house was mine legally and immediately. No waiting for probate, No estate proceedings, no opportunity for anyone to contest. She said the paperwork was already drafted. She said she was telling me now so that I would know, and so that when the time came, I would not be caught off guard. She said, I need you to understand something. When I die, your uncle and your mother will assume they inherit. They will move fast. People who want things always move fast when the person standing between them and those things is gone. You need to be ready for that. I asked her when she was going to actually do the transfer. She said she was going to do it right. She said she wanted me to be 18 so that I was legally an adult and there could be no complications around my age. She said it was 3 years away and she intended to be around for all of them. But just in case, she had provisions in place. She showed me a card. Patricia Osei, attorney at law. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. She said, if anything happens before you're 18, you call her. She has everything. I kept that card in the zipper pocket of every wallet I owned from that day forward. Nothing happened before I was 18. My grandmother was, as she had promised, around for all 3 years. She had a hip replaced at 73 and was back in the garden within 4 months, which the doctor said was remarkable, which my grandmother said was simply a matter of not having time to lie around feeling sorry for herself. I visited every summer and we continued our traditions and she continued teaching me things and telling me stories and the house continued being the realest place I had ever been. The summer I turned 18, I drove myself to her house for the first time. It was the first time I'd made the drive alone, having only just gotten my license, and when I pulled into her gravel driveway and saw her standing on the porch with a cup of coffee waiting for me, I felt something I can only describe as a return, like something in my chest settling back into the right position. 3 days after I arrived, she said she had an appointment. We drove together to Patricia Osei's office, which was above a dry cleaning shop on Main Street, up a narrow staircase that smelled like cedar and old carpet. Patricia Osei was a small woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain and an air of absolute calm that made me feel like whatever happened in this office was going to be handled correctly. She shook my hand. She called me Miss Hargrove, which startled me because I was used to being called Clara, and she put a stack of papers on the desk between us. My grandmother and I sat side by side. Patricia explained each document. She explained what a deed transfer meant and how it was recorded and what it meant for me going forward. She explained the difference between what we were doing and a will, why this was cleaner, why it was more protected. She explained that once the deed was transferred and recorded at the county clerk's office, the house was mine. Not mine when my grandmother died. Mine now. My grandmother would continue living there for the rest of her life. That was understood and documented. But legally, the house was mine. I signed my name 8 times. My grandmother signed her name 8 times. Patricia signed and notarized and made copies and put the originals in a file in her cabinet and gave me a set to take home. She said, "Congratulations, Miss Hargrove." I held the papers in my lap on the drive home and looked out the window at the fields and the trees, and my grandmother hummed something under her breath that I didn't recognize, and neither of us said anything for a long time. When we got back to the house, she parked the car and we sat there for a moment in the driveway, engine off, looking at the white house with the green shutters. She said, "How does it feel?" I said, "It feels like something real." She nodded like that was exactly the right answer. She was diagnosed 18 months later. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, found late the way it almost always is because it doesn't announce itself until it's already made itself at home. I got the phone call in my dorm room in February, second semester of freshman year, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a very long time after I hung up, looking at the window and the snow outside it and the thin gray light of February. I drove to see her the following weekend. She was smaller than I remembered, not in height, but in some quality I didn't have words for. She had always filled rooms without trying. Now she seemed to be taking up a more careful amount of space. But she was still herself. She sat up straight. She told me what the doctors had said in exact terms. No softening, no euphemism. She said she had 6 months to a year. She said she intended to spend that time at home, in her house, which was legally mine but would remain hers to live in for exactly as long as she needed it. She said, "I'm telling you now so you can prepare, emotionally, practically. Your mother will not tell you the truth about how things are progressing because she doesn't like delivering difficult information. Your uncle will be less interested in how I'm doing than in getting things in order, which means he will start asking questions about the estate. Don't let either of them pressure you." I said I wouldn't. She said, call Patricia if anything feels wrong. I said I would. She lived 8 months after the diagnosis. She died on a Tuesday morning in October, in her own bed, in her own house, with her own garden visible from the window, and a nurse who had been with her for the last 2 months holding her hand. I was at school, and I got the call, and I drove the 40 minutes to her house without fully remembering the drive, and when I walked through the door, the house already felt different, not empty, just aware, like it knew. My mother arrived 3 hours later. My uncle arrived the following morning. They both embraced me and said the right things with the right faces, and I held myself together because I had known this was coming, and I had prepared, and also because I was, as my grandmother had once told me, one of the quietest and deepest rivers she had ever known. The funeral was 4 days later. It was a small service, held at the church my grandmother had attended for 40 years, and people came who I didn't know, women from her quilting circle and men from the community garden, and a former student she had tutored decades ago who was now a doctor. They came and they said things about her that made her seem exactly like herself, which is the highest compliment you can pay to someone's funeral. I sat in the front pew, I held the program, I listened to her hymn. And my aunt, who had married my uncle a decade ago and had always approached the world like a person calculating their next advantage, leaned over and whispered that the house would be listed by the end of the week. I looked at her, I didn't say anything, I turned back to the front. She took my silence for shock or grief, or possibly simply for the quiet of a girl who had never mattered much. She was wrong about all of it. After the funeral, people came back to the house, the way they do. Casseroles appeared from nowhere. Someone brought a ham. Someone else brought a sheet cake with pale yellow frosting that my grandmother would have politely described as trying its best. People moved through the rooms and touched things and spoke in low voices, and my grandmother's presence was everywhere, in the curtains she had sewn and the quilts she had made and the photographs on every wall, and I stood in the kitchen and drank coffee and watched my uncle move through the rooms with a different quality of attention. He was looking at the house the way you look at something you think you're going to own. He stopped to examine the crown molding in the hallway. He walked through the kitchen and opened a cabinet and looked at the condition of the shelves. He stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and looked out the window at the acreage with an expression I recognized as calculation. My mother found me in the kitchen and put her arm around me and said, "We're going to get through this, sweetheart. Family takes care of family." I said, "Yes." She said, "Ray has a realtor friend who's going to come look at the house this week. We want to move quickly before the market shifts." I said, "Okay." She pulled back and looked at me. She had never been very good at reading my silences. She had never tried hard enough. She said, "Are you doing all right?" I said I was doing fine. She patted my arm and moved on to another room. That night, after everyone had left, I sat alone in my grandmother's kitchen in the dark for a long time. I had the deed in my bag. I had Patricia O'C's number in my phone. I had 8 months of preparation and a lifetime of watching this family move through the world. And I knew exactly what was coming. The realtor came on Thursday. His name was Derek something, a man in his 50s with a crisp shirt and a portfolio under his arm and the practiced warmth of someone who spent their days walking through other people's histories and turning them into numbers. My uncle let him in. My mother was there. Renata had driven down from her apartment and was sitting on the living room couch on her phone, not particularly interested, but present in the way people are when they expect to benefit from something. I was in the kitchen when I heard Derek begin his walkthrough, heard him speaking in low tones to my uncle about comparable sales and lot value and how quickly he thought they could move if they priced it right. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down and called Patricia O'C. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Clara, I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up?" I said I was holding up well. I told her what was happening. I told her a realtor was walking through the house as we spoke. She said, "I see, and they don't know about the deed transfer." I said, "No." She said, "All right. Here is what I want you to do." She told me she was going to email me a document. She told me it was a recorded copy of the deed transfer, which showed my name as the legal owner of the property. She told me that when the time was right, I should present it. She told me that if anyone gave me any trouble, or if my uncle took any further steps with the realtor, to call her immediately, and she would contact the county. She said, "Clara, that house has been legally yours for 3 years. There is nothing they can do." I said I knew. She said, "Be calm. Your grandmother prepared you for this." I said I knew that too. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for another moment. I could hear Derek in the hallway talking about renovation potential. I could hear my uncle say something about the floors. I could hear my mother say she thought they should have it painted before listing, get a good price out of it. I thought about my grandmother at that table. I thought about her magnifying glass and her cups of tea and her voice telling me to always read the fine print. I thought about her hands, how strong they were. I thought about her standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, waiting for me. I stood up. I walked into the hallway. Derek was standing near the front door making notes in his portfolio. My uncle was beside him. My mother was a few feet away. Renata was still on her phone. I said, "I need to say something." My uncle looked up. He had an expression that was not quite annoyed yet, but was moving in that direction. He had always treated me the way people treat furniture that's been placed slightly wrong in a room, present, but not relevant. He said, "Clara, we're in the middle of something." I said, "I know. That's why I need to say it now." I looked at Derek. I said, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I want to make sure you have accurate information before you do any more work here. This house is not available for sale." Derek lowered his portfolio. He looked from me to my uncle. My uncle said, "Clara." My mother said, "Sweetheart, this isn't the time." I said, "The house was transferred to my name 3 years ago. I have the recorded deed. I'm the legal owner of this property. No listing agreement that anyone signs will be valid because you cannot sell something you don't own." There was a silence. Renata looked up from her phone. My uncle said, "That's not possible." I said, "I have the documentation." He said, "Your grandmother never said anything about Bichuri." I said, "She told me when I was 15. We finalized it the summer I turned 18. It was recorded at the county clerk's office. Patricia Osei has the originals." My uncle's face was doing something complicated. He had always been a man who expected to be accommodated, and the experience of not being accommodated was visibly unfamiliar to him. He said, "This is some kind of mistake." I said, "It's not." My mother was very still. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen her direct at me before. Not quite respect. Something closer to recalibration. Like a person who has been using a map that turns out to be wrong and is trying to figure out where they actually are. Derek put the cap back on his pen. He said, "I'm going to need to excuse myself from this situation." He was very polite about it. He closed his portfolio and shook my uncle's hand briefly and nodded to everyone and let himself out the front door. My uncle said, "Ray?" She said, "Clara, I think you need to explain yourself." I said, "I just did." He said, "Your grandmother did not have the right to give this house to you without consulting the family. This is a family asset." I said, "This was her house. She bought it. She maintained it. She had every right to do whatever she chose with it, including give it to me, which is what she did." He said, "We will contest this." I said, "On what grounds?" He opened his mouth and closed it. I said, "She was of sound mind. The transfer was legal. It was recorded. It's been on file for 3 years. You can consult an attorney if you'd like. I'd recommend it, actually. I think it would be useful for you to hear from someone else what I'm telling you now." My mother sat down on the stairs. She sat down like her legs had made a decision her brain hadn't caught up to. She sat down and looked at her hands. She said, quietly, "She never said anything to me." I said, "No." She said, "She gave it to you." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not to me, not to Ray." I said, "She wanted me to have it." There was a long silence. The house was very quiet around us. The afternoon light was coming through the windows in the particular way it had in October, low and golden and honest. My uncle said, "This isn't over." I said, "Okay." He picked up his jacket from the chair by the door and he left. He left without saying goodbye. He walked out of his mother's house, the house where he had grown up, the house that would never belong to him, and he got in his car and he drove away. My mother stayed. She stayed sitting on the stairs for a long time after he left, and eventually Renata came and sat next to her, and the two of them sat there together in the way that people sit when they've just been asked to reorganize a reality they thought they understood. I went to the kitchen and made tea. Not because I was particularly calm, but because my grandmother had always made tea when things were difficult and the motion of making it was familiar and I needed something familiar. I brought 2 cups to my mother and my sister. My mother took hers and held it in both hands without drinking it. She said, "When did she tell you?" "About the house." I said, "When I was 15, on the porch, during a thunderstorm." She said, "I didn't know she was." She stopped, started again. "I didn't know she was worried about us." I said, "About the house, specifically." She said, "About what would happen to it." I said, "Yes." She said, "She thought we would sell it." I said, "I think she knew you would." She didn't argue with that. Renata had put her phone in her pocket. She was looking at me in a way that was different from her usual way, which was mostly through me or past me. She was actually looking at me. She said, "Did Grandma Estelle ever talk to you about us? About Mom and Uncle Ray?" I said, "She loved you. She just knew you differently than she knew me." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means she saw what she saw." I didn't say it with anger. I didn't have anger in me at that moment. I had something more complicated, something that had been sitting in my chest for a long time that felt like grief and like relief and like the strange specific sadness of being right about something you would have preferred to be wrong about. In the weeks that followed, my uncle consulted 2 attorneys. Both told him what I had told him. The transfer was airtight. The deed had been recorded. The house was mine. He sent me an email that used the word unfair 7 times, and I read it once and filed it and did not respond. He called my mother and complained at length. She told him she didn't know what to do with the information either. Eventually, he stopped. My mother called me 3 weeks later on a Sunday evening. She said she had been thinking. She said she had been thinking a lot, actually, about things she maybe could have done differently when I was growing up. She didn't use specific examples. She spoke in general terms, the way people do when they're acknowledging something without wanting to fully examine it. But it was more than she had said before, more than she had ever said before, and I listened. I said, "I know things weren't always easy." She said, "I think I didn't always see you clearly." I said, "No." She said, "I think I'm sorry about that." I said, "I know." There was a silence between us, and in that silence was a whole history and a lot of hurt, and also, I thought, maybe the small beginning of something else. I didn't know yet what it would be. I didn't make her any promises. But I stayed on the phone with her for another hour that evening, and we talked about my grandmother, and we talked about the house, and she told me a story about a summer when she was a girl that I had never heard before, a summer when Grandma Estelle taught her to make preserves, and the preserves exploded in the jars, and they both laughed until they couldn't breathe. I listened to the story, and I thought about my grandmother young, and I thought about my mother young, and I thought about the way people become who they are, the long, strange road of it. Renata texted me a week after that, just to say hi. I texted back. It wasn't much, back. It wasn't much, but it was something. I went back to the house the following summer. I took a leave of absence from school because I wanted the time and because the house needed someone to be in it and because I needed to be in the house. I slept in the room I had always slept in when I visited, the small room at the back with the window that looked out over the garden. I woke up early and drank coffee on the porch the way my grandmother had done for 50 years. I walked the property in the mornings when the light was low and the dew was still on the grass. The garden needed work. She had kept it immaculate for decades, but the last 2 years of her illness had been hard on it, and things had grown in directions they shouldn't have, and some things had died that didn't need to stay dead. I worked it the way she had taught me from the ground up. I got my hands in the soil, and I understood what she had meant about the house knowing her, because the garden knew her too. Every choice she had made was still visible in the layout of it, in the things she had chosen to grow, and where she had placed them. I found her garden journals in a box in the potting shed. 40 years of notes, what she planted and when, what thrived and what didn't, the weather each year and the yield, and her observations about which methods worked and which she was abandoning. I sat in the potting shed and read them for hours. It was the most complete record of a life I had ever seen, a life made of seasons and soil and attention. I kept every journal. I have them still. I found other things in the house that summer, things I hadn't known were there. A box of letters from her parents, written in the careful handwriting of people who had not had much schooling but who had chosen their words with great care. A collection of seeds from vegetables she had cultivated herself, labeled in her handwriting, some of them varieties I couldn't find in any catalog. A small notebook in the drawer of her bedside table that turned out to be a private record of her thoughts. Not a diary exactly, but something like it. observations about her life and the people in it, and the things she believed. I read every word of that notebook. I will not share what was in it. It was hers, and it stays between us. What I will say is that she had written about me. She had written about the summers I spent with her, and the things she had tried to teach me, and what she hoped I would do with my life. She had written about the afternoon on the porch when she had told me about the house. She had written, Clara listened the way she always listens, completely and without interruption. And when I was done, she pressed her hand against the wall of the kitchen like she was saying hello to it. I think she understands. I think she will be all right. I pressed my hand against the kitchen wall when I read that. I stood in the kitchen of my house, and I pressed my hand against the wall, and I thought, yes, I understand. I think I understand more every day. Patricia Osei called me that fall to check in. She asked how I was doing and how the house was doing, and I told her about the garden and the journals and the seed collection. She said my grandmother had talked about me often in their years of working together. She said Estelle had been a careful woman and a deliberate woman, and that everything she had done with intention. She said she knew exactly what she was doing. She always did. I said I knew. She said, she was proud of you, Clara. I want you to know that. She said it plainly. She said, my granddaughter is the quietest river you've ever seen, but watch out for the current. I laughed. It came up out of me suddenly, a real laugh, the kind that's partly grief and partly love and partly the shock of being known so completely by someone you can no longer talk to. I think about her every day. I think about her in the mornings when the light comes through the kitchen window the way it always did. I think about her when I work in the garden and when I read the journals and when I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the day begin. I think about her when I lock the door at night and when I look at the green shutters and when I find things in the house that her hands made. She gave me something that cannot be contested or transferred or sold out from under me. She gave me the place where I learned who I was. She gave me the proof that someone had paid attention. She gave me 40 years of garden journals and a room with a window and a porch where the mornings are quiet and real. She gave me a home. My uncle sends me a card at Christmas now. Not warm exactly, but civil. My mother and I talk on the phone about once a month. She came to visit in the spring and we walked the garden together, and she showed me where she used to play as a child, a spot near the old oak tree at the back of the property that she had forgotten about for years and then suddenly remembered. She stood there for a long time, next to that tree, with a complicated expression, and I stood next to her and didn't say anything. Renata came in the summer. She stayed for a weekend. She helped me in the garden, and we talked more in those 2 days than we had talked in the preceding 10 years. She told me things about our childhood that she had never said before, things that surprised me, ways in which she had felt the pressure of being the favorite that I had not thought about, the weight of it, the way expectation sits on a person. I listened. I did not rush to defend my own experience or compare. I just listened. On her last morning, we sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the sun come up over the garden, and she said, I didn't know how much she loved you. I said, I know. She said, I think I was jealous when I was young. I think I knew there was something between you and Grandma Estelle that I didn't have access to. I didn't understand what it was. I said, what do you think it was? She thought about it. She said, I think she saw you, really saw you, and I think you saw her back. I said, yes, that's exactly what it was. We sat with that for a while. The light came up over the garden slowly, the way October light does, not arriving so much as accumulating. The trees were turning. The last of the garden's late-season crops were still standing, kale and root vegetables, and the herbs she had always kept in the bed along the south wall. There were birds I had learned to name, birds she had taught me to name, and they were doing what birds do in the early morning, which is announce themselves without apology. I thought about her question, the one from the porch when I was 7, about the quietest rivers. I thought I understand it better now than I did then. I think she was telling me something about myself that she could see even when I couldn't. She was telling me that the depth was not a disadvantage. She was telling me that the quiet was not the same as empty. She was telling me that the things that run deep are the ones that last. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things. I own this house. I own the 2 acres and the green shutters and the potting shed with the 40 years of journals and the seed collection with the varieties no catalog carries. I own the view from the back bedroom window and the porch where the coffee is good and the mornings are honest. I own the wall in the kitchen that knew her stories and now knows mine. The family thought they knew what would happen when she was gone. They thought they knew because they had spent their lives assuming they were the ones who mattered, assuming that the quiet girl in the corner was too far in the background to be given anything real. They thought wrong. My grandmother was a deliberate woman. She was a careful woman. She had grown up with nothing and built everything through attention and intention and an absolute refusal to let the wrong people win. She passed those things to me the way you pass something precious, with both hands, making sure you have the other person's eyes before you let go. I have not wasted what she gave me. I am still here. I am in this house every day, in this house that smells like her and holds her stories and keeps her seeds. I am in her garden with my hands in her soil. I am on her porch with her coffee in the same kind of cup she always used. I am quiet. I am deep. I am the thing that runs through this land and will keep running long after anyone who bet against me has given up and gone home. She knew that. She always knew. She built this place for exactly that purpose, and she gave it to exactly the right person. And the house knows, the way she always said it would. It knows every story that was ever told inside it, and it knows mine now too. And every morning when the light comes through the kitchen window and falls on the wall where both our hands have pressed, I think yes. I think this is what real feels like. I think this is what it means to be seen. I think I'm finally home.